Tonight on KQED Newsroom, yes, the rich really do keep getting richer. Famed economist Robert Reich joins us to talk about the pandemic windfall for America's billionaires. Also, from district attorney to attorney general to senator to vice presidential running mate, we dive into Kamala Harris's new role on the road to the White House. And scientists at UCSF say they may have discovered a new way to block the coronavirus before it can harm lungs. Welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Priya David Clemens. Vice President Joe Biden selected his running mate this week, California Senator Kamala Harris. Harris ran for the top seat on the presidential ticket but dropped out of the race in December. She has also served as California Attorney General and San Francisco's District Attorney. She's the first black woman and the first woman of Indian descent to run for the vice presidency, and only the third female candidate as vice president on a major party ticket. Harris will play a key role in the Democratic National Convention, which begins next week in Wisconsin. Joining me now by Skype from San Francisco is KQED politics and government correspondent Marisa Lagos, and also joining us by Skype from San Francisco is KQED senior editor of politics and government Scott Shafer. Scott and Marisa, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Well, we've all three known and covered Kamala Harris for many years. I remember covering her back in 2005 when I first came to the Bay Area and she was district attorney. Scott, tell us about your early experiences with Kamala Harris, what she was like, and how you've seen her change.
Well, she was a political novice when she ran for district attorney in 2003. She challenged an incumbent. And I think something happened very early in her career that shaped the rest of her trajectory to where she is today. A San Francisco police officer was shot and killed. She had promised in the campaign not to seek the death penalty, and she didn't. And that reaction from the police union and others really shook her. And I think she spent, in some ways, the next 15 years trying to make amends with law enforcement groups. And so when she became attorney general, she was more cautious, more political in some ways. She was slow to embrace legalizing medical marijuana. She was slow to embrace body cams for police, automatic investigations and reviews of deadly police shootings. And so when she announced that she was running for president as a progressive prosecutor, she got some pushback from those on the left who felt that she really wasn't as progressive as, perhaps she portrayed herself to be, or that they wished she had been. Now, that may not hurt her now running in a national campaign as vice president, but we have seen her evolve from the early days when she ran for DA.
And I'm sure some of those issues will come up in the attacks against her. Marisa, what's the analysis of why Joe Biden chose Kamala Harris to be on his ticket? What does she bring?
Well, I mean, she brings the experience Scott just mentioned. She's been in government for over 15 years. She is, battle tested. She was one of that very long list of Democrats running for the presidential nomination last year and earlier this year. I think that ultimately, I think it's sort of a combination of, is this someone I can govern with if I win? But also, is this somebody that I feel comfortable being with? I mean, Joe Biden and Barack Obama were famously very close, and Kamala Harris actually worked with Joe Biden's deceased son, Beau, when they were both attorneys general. And I think that personal relationship may have been one of the things that put this over the top. He adored his son, and Kamala Harris, by all accounts, really had a great relationship with Beau Biden as well.
Marisa, is there any electoral calculus that goes into this decision? You're talking a lot about the personal interactions. Does Joe Biden hope that she's going to bring more female votes? He already has strong support among African-American voters. Where's the political math?
Yeah, I mean, look, we've never seen a vice presidential candidate in recent memory change the dynamic. The two women that you mentioned who are on major party tickets, Sarah Palin, you'll recall, was put on in part because the McCain campaign was flailing. So you certainly can't blame them. Obviously, California is a safe blue state. But I do think, given Joe Biden's age and the fact that he's white in this moment of sort of racial reckoning in this nation, that there is a hope that she will not only bring along black voters and maybe younger voters, but excite them. Get people who may have sat this election out and come out. And I think, that's a calculation we'll only be able to know if it works after November.
Scott, Governor Newsom has said he won't speak about who he might appoint to Harris's senatorial seat until January 2021. But, we can still speculate. So what do you think? Who are the options for who might fill in that seat?
Well, a lot of people are already reaching out to him and asking that they consider them. First of all, let's see who he's replacing. Kamala Harris, a woman of color. So there will be pressure on him to pick at least a woman and maybe a Latino or a Latina, somebody who, well, we've never had a Latinx senator. So somebody like Javier Becerra, the Attorney General, or Alex Padilla, the Secretary of State, Elena Durazo, who's a state senator from Los Angeles. If he appoints somebody who's already a statewide office holder like those two, or somebody like Betty Yee, the controller, then he gets to appoint somebody to replace that job as well. So he would get a twofer. But, there's going to be geographic considerations. There'll be age considerations. And don't forget, Dianne Feinstein is, 86, 87 years old. So there's a possibility she's long been rumored to be thinking of stepping down in the middle of her term. We'll see if that happens. But there's no shortage of candidates. California has a lot of people in that generation below where Jerry Brown was, and Willie Brown, people who like Kamala Harris and Gavin Newsom, who are just waiting for their chance to sort of step up. And then I should say also people like Adam Schiff, who is down in Los Angeles. Of course, he would be a strong contender. However, I don't think it's the year of the white male. That would be my guess.
Marisa, I want to wade into this discussion about the Postal Service. There are all sorts of pieces to this, but the latest that came out is that the Postal Service is warning that 46 states could be negatively impacted in their mail-in ballots, that they could be disenfranchised is the term that's being used. Talk to us a little bit about what they're seeing as a problem, what they're warning about, and how it could impact the vote in November.
Well, as a lot of people have probably heard, the president did appoint kind of a political appointee to head the post office. We have seen a slowdown in mail service. There was already concern in a year of a pandemic when so many voters have, understandable concerns about going to the polls and their own health, that this would potentially overwhelm a service that has, quite frankly, been a political football in Washington for a very long time. I think that right now what we're seeing is on top of the kind of existing structural challenges, the governor called today intentional sabotage by this administration, taking away machines, cutting into staffing and other resources. Californians, I should say, should not be as worried as I think 46 other states in D.C., which is what those letters really warned about. We have a very robust kind of system with a lot of checks and balances to ensure that people can get their ballots to the elections officials. They have until, I think, November 20th for those to be counted. So as long as they're postmarked by Election Day in California, it should be fine. And I think people should, understand that the mail is not the only way to get a vote by mail ballot in. You could drop it off at a voting center, at a polling place. There are options, and I think that people are going to have to be creative. I think what's important is that we keep talking about this so everybody understands kind of when and where they need to get their ballots in.
Coming up next week is the DNC, mostly virtual, like it has never been before, but like so much is today. Scott, can you give us a preview of what we should be expecting to see out of the Democratic National Convention next week?
Well, Priya, we're really in uncharted territory here. Those baseball games we've been seeing with the cardboard cutouts of fans? It's going to be a little bit like that. No one's going to Milwaukee. Biden and Kamala Harris are going to be in Delaware. The delegates aren't going to Milwaukee. And so just imagine having to give these speeches, which are intended to be rousing with lots of applause lines, and there's really nobody applauding. And so it's a little awkward. 4 years ago, Maurice and I were in Philadelphia for the Democratic convention there. And being there with all those people, although there was a lot of just stuff that's superfluous, you do get a sense of where the party is, where the divisions are. We're not going to get to see that this time around. And some of the more further left delegates aren't going to have the impact that they would have liked to have on issues like Medicare for all.
It is going to be different. Scott Shafer with KQED, Marisa Lagos with KQED as well. Thank you both so much, our talented politics team.
Thanks, Priya.
Thank you.
The drop in America's gross domestic product last quarter was the worst on record. Although millions of Americans have lost jobs and filed for unemployment, the federal government still remains at an impasse on providing more financial relief. And despite the drastic contraction of the economy in most sectors, big tech companies like Facebook and Amazon are posting major profits. Former Labor Secretary Robert Reich says it's just the latest example of the enormous economic gap between the haves and the have-nots in America. Joining me now by Skype from Berkeley is Robert Reich, UC Berkeley Professor of Public Policy and U.S. Labor Secretary under President Bill Clinton. Robert, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Priya.
So the big political news this week was that Joe Biden selected Senator Kamala Harris as his running mate. As a progressive yourself, what do you think of this pairing and their chances in November?
Well, I think their chances in November are very, very good. And as a progressive, a self-styled progressive, I'll tell you, I think that anybody who is going to contribute to getting Donald Trump, the worst president in American history, out of office, gets my vote.
Let's turn directly to the economy now. We've heard from economists that the U.S. is in its worst financial state since the Great Depression. Can you talk us through some of the metrics that explain why this is so much worse than, say, the recession in 2008?
Well, the recession in 2008 was not nearly as bad in the sense that right now we have across the country, about 30 to 40 million people unemployed, about 1 out of every 4 to 5 workers. This is about what it was in the worst parts of the Great Depression of the 1930s. It's hard to imagine this degree of unemployment. A lot of people are on the verge of getting evicted if they are renters. Many people cannot pay their mortgages. And, you know, what worries me most, Priya, is that the federal government is not stepping in as it did in the 1930s when we had that crisis of the Great Depression. The federal government right now is at loggerheads. There's no money going out anymore to people in extra unemployment benefits. I'm frankly terrified about what's going to happen.
Well, so let's talk about that. What are 2 or 3 things you think the federal government should be doing right now?
Right now, extend the $600 a week extra federal unemployment benefits. It is outrageous that they stopped. People are worse off than they were before. The coronavirus is really behind all of this economic downturn. The virus is surging across America, and that means that a lot of the economic activity that we began to see upturn in June has actually gone down again. And this is intolerable, and the government must act. The fact that the Republicans went off for a recess and did not come up with any agreement at all, I think it's frankly shameful.
So if the government does not act, how much further do you expect the economy to tumble?
I would expect, because these $600 a week checks are now no longer being distributed, people don't have money in their pockets. I mean, 30 to 35 million people don't have money now. They can't turn around and buy things. And if people can't buy things, that means that sellers, small businesses, companies are not going to be able to sell things, which means more unemployment. I would sadly expect unemployment over the next month or two to go up much higher. Many more people will lose jobs.
So because of this economic shutdown, we have had a multitude of social problems arise, right? So we're talking about housing instability, food instability, domestic violence on the rise, just to name a few. Do you see the U.S. economy reopening, say, early 2021 when a vaccine is released, or do you think it's going to be later than that?
Well, it is going to be dependent on a vaccine. We've lost control. I mean, the Trump administration basically punted on the entire coronavirus. Relative to every other advanced nation in the world that has got some control over the coronavirus, we lost control. 166,000 Americans have died since March. I mean, it almost boggles the mind. And we're not going to be able to safely reopen the economy until we do get control. I don't think we're going to see it until March or maybe April.
So while the pandemic has had a net negative impact, it certainly had a positive impact on some billionaires who are out there. And you've spoken out very strongly against this. What does this say about the structure of our economy in America?
It says that the structure of our economy really is top-heavy in the sense that the typical American is making, even before the pandemic, was barely holding on. Wages were almost the same, if you adjust for inflation, almost the same as they were 40 years ago for most Americans. But you had a small group at the top, and they are getting richer and richer. The billionaires of America have never had it so good. I mean, Jeff Bezos, he made $13 billion in one day 2 weeks ago. And his fortune and the fortune of people who are well situated, who have essentially monopolies. And let's not mince words. I mean, these are monopolies. When people can't go out to shop, then they have to rely on online shopping. How many online places are there that are well established? Well, you essentially have Amazon and maybe Walmart, and that's it.
Robert, you yourself are a person of privilege as a wealthy, relatively speaking, white male. Why do you speak out against those privileges?
Well, because it's unjust, it's unfair. I mean, my whole life, I have been working, teaching, writing, fighting in the trenches sometimes for a society that is more socially just. We have to do this. When I was growing up, my father had a little clothing store in Scranton, Pennsylvania, on Main Street, and he catered to and sold dresses to the wives of factory workers. My father was dependent on those factory workers getting enough money because his small business couldn't pay his bills if those factory workers were not earning enough. And so he was in favor of unions, and he was in favor of people being able to get ahead, because we're all in this together. If the pandemic has not shown us anything, it's shown us that even though people of color have taken a particular beating in this pandemic, everybody is in trouble, and the entire economy is in trouble. The small sliver of very wealthy people who are doing better and better, they can't continue to do better and better if people don't have money to buy.
Robert, California's unemployment rate is about 15%, which is considerably higher than the national average, more like 10%. Are there specific factors about our state that could make recovery easier or harder than other states?
Well, one of the things about California is we are one of the most unequal states in terms of earnings and wealth. And that means that when the state takes a dive, where the national economy takes a dive, the lower income people in the state get hit. They get really clobbered, which essentially means that the entire state suffers because they don't have the wherewithal to buy, and they also need social services.
Due to the pandemic, the state has a $54 billion deficit. Now, if we get money from the federal government as states, won't that be adding to the national debt? And aren't we just robbing Peter to pay Paul, as the old saying goes?
No, the states cannot run deficits by state constitutions. The federal government can, and it is precisely times like this, where you have mass unemployment and tremendous social needs, that the federal government has got to step in. That's what we learned in the Great Depression of the 1930s. It's what we learn over and over again. The federal government is the spender of last resort when people need help and when we've got to stimulate the economy.
But specifically, the national debt, is that something we should not be concerned about?
Not now. In fact, right now, that's the last thing we ought to be concerned about. As Franklin D. Roosevelt understood during the 1930s, you've got to spend in order to get people employed, in order to stimulate the economy. And if you don't do that, then the debt gets worse because there's not any economic activity.
Professor Robert Reich, former labor secretary and professor at UC Berkeley, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Prue.
This week, scientists at UC San Francisco announced the early stage of what could become a promising new way to protect people from coronavirus infection until a vaccine is developed. In a lab, they engineered a tiny antibody to act like a molecular mousetrap. It latches onto spikes that coronavirus molecules use to invade cells in the airways and pump out copies of the virus, devastating lungs and other organs. They call their discovery AeroNabs, and unlike other treatments, it could be administered with an inhaler or nasal spray at home instead of a hospital. We want to note that this research has not yet been peer-reviewed. Joining me now by Skype are the two co-inventors of AeroNabs, UCSF biochemistry and biophysics professor Peter Walter, and UCSF assistant professor of pharmaceutical chemistry Ashish Manglik. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Ashish, the first question's to you. As I mentioned, this study has not yet been peer-reviewed. Why not? Why go ahead and publish before your peers have a chance to check out your work and raise any concerns with it?
It's a great question, Priya. So typically, the way that we conduct scientific research, and as it has been done for a long period of time, has been to submit a new finding to a journal and have it peer-reviewed. In the context of the coronavirus pandemic, much of the scientific research around coronavirus is first being put up to a preprint server, in this case, a server called bioRxiv. where we can share our findings with the rest of the scientific community such that they can start evaluating and start building upon it in real time. If we were to wait for a regular journal to peer review the work and then publish it, that could set us back by a couple of months, which in the current pandemic it doesn't really meet the urgency of the situation.
Peter, can you tell us about the idea behind AeroNabs and why you decided to pursue this approach to fighting the coronavirus?
Yes, so we were thinking that if we could develop a small molecule like an AeroNab that would just attach to the virus, it would be so robust that we could deliver it to the airways and to the lung spaces. We could interfere with the virus. We could trap it at a stage when it's trying to invade our bodies. So before it has a chance of interacting with the cells, the human cells, that then it uses as a first step in the invasion process. So if we trap it early in infection, or even prophylactically have these molecular mouse traps present in the airways, we could prevent the virus from ever developing severe disease.
And these nanobodies that you'll be using, they come from camels and llamas?
They are mimicked, they are inspired by antibodies that are naturally circulating in llamas. So Ashish's lab took the scaffolding and created a synthetic library of 2 billion of these kind of nanobodies, which we call AeroNabs. And out of these 2 billion, then we selected some leads. We optimized them to be incredibly tight binders for the virus and incredibly powerful inactivating agents.
Ashish, what have been some of the biggest challenges for you in doing this research?
Yes, the general challenge in finding these nanobodies in the first place is that typically people have to immunize a llama or an alpaca to go find them. And what Peter just described is some of the technology we've been building to be able to do this completely in the lab. So in some ways, we had been building technology for other purposes to overcome the challenge of finding these kinds of nanobodies in the first place. And in the coronavirus pandemic, we pivoted to basically use that approach to fight the virus. But then at a more practical level, one of the big challenges has been that, normally we can move at a really rapid pace in the lab, but just in order to maintain the health and safety of everybody involved, we had to come up with very unique approaches to be able to continue the work at a rapid pace, but still be safe. And the students and trainees and postdoctoral fellows that did this project did a remarkable job of, working tirelessly, essentially, but again, with safety measures in place.
And I understand that you needed to actually take your time in the lab down to 25% of what you might have had in the past. Peter, the ultimate goal of this product is to get it to the mass market, to get it out to people through an inhaler or a nasal spray, perhaps. What still needs to happen before it can get there?
Yeah, so we engineered the molecule with properties that should allow and we know it is stable to aerosolization. It is stable to being dried down as a powder, and it resists high temperatures. So it's a very robust molecule that can be delivered in a format that we can think of formulating it as a nasal spray or as an inhalable agent that penetrates deep into the lung spaces. What needs to happen right now, we are looking actively for a partner to collaborate with in this adventure.
A pharmaceutical company.
A pharmaceutical company who will then put it into the safety testing and efficacy testing, and then formulation procedures so that it can be put on the market.
And Ashish, what sort of a timeline are we looking at there?
Yeah, so there's a number of activities that still have to be done, as Peter described. And one of the things that we've been inspired by in the coronavirus pandemic and the response to it has been the really creative approaches to go fast for new therapies, but remain safe. So we're not skip critical steps that are required to bring new options to patients. And we're seeing that really beautiful work in the vaccine space currently. So it's hard to predict a specific timeline because we have to do this in the right manner. But our hope is that by early next year at the latest, we could have molecules that are actively in human trials.
Now, that could be the same time as a vaccine starts to become available as well. Is that also your understanding? And if so, what then is the relationship between this spray and a potential vaccine?
Yeah, great question. So we all, hope for an amazing, durable vaccine that provides long-lasting immunity that can be widely deployable to the entire world. That's what we all hope for in order to get back to some sense of normalcy. Now, whether that's going to happen on the first go of the first vaccines that are being developed, whether those vaccines provide durable immunity, and whether those vaccines are truly deployable to a large enough segment of the population that they prevent transmission, I think are all really open questions. So we think that molecules like this would provide a bridge to a vaccine, to an ideal vaccine. And even in the context of a vaccine, there's likely segments of the population that may not get durable immunity from a vaccine, or the vaccine may not be as effective, or where you really might want a secondary measure on top of a vaccine. And we think that this kind of approach would remain pretty useful in those contexts.
Peter, despite it being a difficult time to be a scientist in some ways, are you also finding that there are new ways of working you'd like to keep even after the pandemic crisis is over?
Well, one of the wonderful things that has happened under these very adverse working conditions, reduced time and reduced support facilities, one thing we've been experiencing is that people really came together and worked so much more as a team. So I think this has brought out this incredibly collaborative environment in which people volunteer their time, they volunteer their expertise, and they help each other in ways that normally we haven't seen all that often in the lab.
It's very remarkable and also encouraging to hear, so thank you. Dr. Peter Walter, Dr. Ashish Manglik, both professors also at UC San Francisco. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you so much, Priya.
You can find more of our coverage at kqed.org/kqed-newsroom. I'm Priya David Clemens. You can reach me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Priya D. Clemens. From all of us here at KQED, thanks for watching. Good night.